Alright, so tonight right now, it's day maybe when you're watching, I'm not sure, you can see it's still day-ish. But anyway, evening, right? Alright, so today is going to be Intro to Plato. You're probably working on finishing your exam, so I'm going to post one video today, on Tuesday, for you to watch, because I really want you to read the Plato before I discuss it. So just so we all have a chance to read it, without focusing on exams. This is just going to kind of be an intro to Plato, and then we'll really dive in on Thursday after you've read the text. So we're moving now from human life and its meaning more to knowledge. And knowledge, remember, is justified true belief. Now, it's not that we've completely left human life and its meaning behind, right? Knowledge is still a part of human life and its meaning. Remember, Heidegger talked about, look, the question of the meaning of being is what drove Plato and Aristotle and some of these ancient folks. And he's right. It was. But in order to get to human life and its meaning, they had to cover a lot of other ground as well, including things like knowledge and justification and truth and belief. And we're starting somewhat arbitrarily with Plato. Cottingham in the back of the book has a little paragraph biography of each of the philosophers covered in the textbook. And he starts off with, Plato is rightly considered the beginning of Western philosophy. Schrappe disagrees slightly. Again, as I talked about before, these philosophical questions have probably been around since, the beginning of humanity. Purpose and why and all of that. How do we know things? What is knowledge anyway? Maybe not formalized in the same way that Western philosophy has done so, but these questions have been there. Sorry, lost my train of thought. So we begin with Plato because here are the bad reasons we start with Plato. He's a white guy from Europe. And sure, Western civilization kind of has its beginnings in places like Greece, which is where Plato is from. But the fact he's a white guy doesn't hurt. As I said before, not only all of society, but academia is an aspect of society, and so it has a really bad history of being racist and misogynistic. Schrappe tries to overcome that, even though I am a white guy also. But we'll talk about some female philosophers like Susan Wolf from last time, some African-American philosophers Cornel West have referenced multiple times, W.E.B. Du Bois, whom I mentioned last time and the time before. And more research suggests that a lot of what Plato is putting forth was actually African philosophy, primarily Northern African philosophy. But that's still in its initial stages of development. So those are the bad reasons to start with Plato. The good reasons to start with Plato, and there are some, we have his complete works, which is huge. Imagine that you have a diary or a journal or a blog or a vlog, right? I guess that's a video log, right? A vlog or something. If I were to just rip out a page or a paragraph here and there, would that necessarily be representative of your thinking as a whole? Not necessarily. It may be an aspect of something much larger, or it may be that random thing that you had, that random thought that one day that doesn't fit with anything else, right? And so prior to Plato, we only have fragments, pieces. And so we piece them together and presume certain things about philosophy and philosophers, but we don't really know. Plato, we have the complete work. So we know how everything fits together with everything else, when he's being ironic, when he's being serious, based on everything else. So that's a good reason. Good reason number two is that Plato is sort of, given the style that he's writing in dialogue form. Given the way that he's writing, he can enter into conversation with, literally, conversation with the competing ideas that are out there. And so it becomes somewhat like a compendium of ancient thought, generally speaking. And Plato sort of is commenting on those through the character of Socrates. So Plato does not appear in any of his dialogues. Socrates is the main character of his dialogues. Now, so in order to tell the story of Plato, we got to tell the story of Socrates. Socrates, however, famously wrote nothing. Okay? And just to give you kind of a timeline here, Got my smaller board today. We're going to talk about Plato. But in order to talk about Plato, we have to back up to Socrates. Plato was one of Socrates' mentees, mentor-mentee type relationship. Socrates had a lot of mentees who were kind of learning the trade, learning the craft of philosophy, whatever that means, right? Plato was the scribe of the group, so he was recording these conversations. Socrates never wrote anything down, but what he did is he went into the marketplace in Athens and had conversations, primarily with young noblemen, the people who were being trained in a certain way so that they would then become leaders of the city-state of Athens. And that's going to become important in a little bit. Plato then was the mentor of Aristotle, whom we'll also cover probably next week. Okay? And we'll see there's great contrast between what Plato believed to be true and what Aristotle believes to be true. Okay? Interestingly enough, then, Aristotle was the personal tutor of Alexander the Great, who, of course, conquered most of the known world at the time, Europe, Northern Africa, some over into the Middle East. And so there's this lineage that ties back, this genealogy that goes all the way back to Socrates. Okay? But Socrates didn't write anything. But we do know some things about Socrates, and there is some debate about the historical Socrates versus the fictional Socrates. Because, of course, as is the case with anyone, and especially the further back in time you go, history and legend kind of get merged together. King Arthur may or may not have actually existed, right? There's great debate about that. William Shakespeare, much more recent than Plato. Plato writing in 300 BC, much more recent, late 1500s, early 1600s. Nobody's quite sure who it is that really wrote the plays. Was it actually William Shakespeare from Stratford-upon-Avon, this seemingly failed playwright who suddenly started writing brilliant things? Or was it a member of the royalty who then gave these things to William Shakespeare because only someone of royal blood would have insight into the inner workings of the court? Maybe it was a number of authors who were contributing and William Shakespeare just signed his name to them. We don't know. And that was just, what, 300 years ago, 400 years ago? And we don't know. So we sure as heck don't know much about Socrates. So what we do know then, we've kind of gleaned from Plato's writings and a few others, Xenophon and some others, who wrote about Socrates. But it seems most scholars agree that some of these events actually occurred, such as Socrates going to the Oracle of Delphi, and the Oracle of Delphi saying that he was the wisest of all men. Socrates, this is, the wisest of all men. Socrates himself claimed that he knew nothing. Now, a couple of layers to that. One, he may have just been toying with everyone. Because given what Socrates is doing, he's engaging in a question and answer, conversations with. And so if you come in with, I know everything, the Oracle of Delphi said I'm the wisest, here you go, yeah, people aren't going to be as receptive. This is where we get the Socratic method from, by the way, which is what most college courses are built upon. Where I, the professor, even if I do have all of the answers, which I don't, by the way, even if I have all of the answers, I don't just give them to you. No. Instead, I ask you a series of leading questions so that you come up with the answers on your own. Maybe they're the same answers I have. Maybe they're different answers. It shouldn't really matter, right? As I mentioned with Bertrand Russell, the important part of philosophy is the questions, not necessarily the answers. It's the questions which lead to answers, right? The perchings and flights from William James. And so this is the Socratic method. Socrates never gave answers. He only asked questions so that these young noblemen were forced to think for themselves to come up with their own answers. Socrates also never wrote anything. As I said, Plato wrote things down. And so scholars seem to think that Plato's writings fall into about three major time periods. There's the early dialogues, which are probably fairly accurate retellings of conversations that really took place. That this is Plato as scribe, just recording these conversations. And that's the Socrates that never gives answers, only asks questions. Then we get to the middle period, where the Socrates character begins to change. He's still asking questions, but he's also giving some answers now too. And so some scholars claim perhaps this really was what Socrates believed to be true, and that it was his inner circle, his mentees, that he revealed these things to, that he told these things to, right? He taught these things to, and Plato then is just now recording these things. Hey, Socrates told us in secret. Here's how they would have played out in a conversation. Or perhaps this is actually Plato just using the now familiar mouthpiece of the character of Socrates. Rather than suddenly inserting Plato into the story, he's going to continue to use Socrates. But Socrates himself has developed as a character from one who knows nothing to one who actually now perhaps is the wisest of all men. There may also be something to be said for the wisest of all men knowing that they don't know anything, because then they're ready to learn so that they can become the wisest, right? That the wisest are the ones who don't think they're that wise, possibly. Okay. Lots of different readings, lots of different interpretations. There's a very Eastern reading of that too that I think is really interesting. We won't get into that. This is Western philosophy, and this is just intro to Plato to prepare you for the reading, right? And then we get into late Plato, which is its own interesting thing if you get into Plato and so forth, where he's sort of referencing other works, and it's wild and crazy. But anyway, so let's get back to Socrates, because that lays the groundwork for Plato. Okay, Socrates, wisest of all men, claimed he knew nothing, and was a self-described torpedo fish in these conversations, that he was picking apart what these young noblemen were saying. These young noblemen would be talking about things like, beauty, isn't it wonderful? And he would ask the simple question, hey, what do you mean by beauty? What is that anyway? Right? I mean, you're being educated. You're going to take over the city-state one day. Surely you know what you're talking about when you spout off about these grand ideals like beauty, right? So what is it? Define it for us. Well, when I speak about beauty, I speak about things like the flowers and, women and men and so on and so forth, and the form and... Okay, says Socrates, and I'm obviously paraphrasing for brevity's sake. Most of the dialogues begin this way. Hey, what's this thing? And then the young nobleman gives examples of, rather than defining the thing. And so Socrates will then say, okay, you've given me examples, but what I'm looking for is a definition. What is it all these things share? What do they all have in common, such that they're all beautiful? And so these dialogues go on back and forth for a while, and they dig in, and eventually we, the reader, realize this young nobleman has no idea what they're talking about. Right? They're using these words to make it seem as though they know what they're talking about, because eventually they want to get elected to political office. Now, thankfully, 21st century United States, very different than ancient Greece. Every politician who uses these big words, of course, knows exactly what they're talking about when they use them. No, they don't. No, nothing's changed, okay? Use the big words, make people think you know what you're talking about so that you can get elected into a position of power. Whether you actually know what you're talking about or not. Which will impact Plato greatly later on in his writings. Here's another thing that impacts Plato greatly with regards to Socrates. These young noblemen have these conversations and walk away very confused. Like, I thought I knew stuff. Now I know that I don't. So now maybe I'm ready to learn, but we'll get more on that later. Probably next time. But they go home to mom and dad, and they're like, this strange thing happened in the market today. Like, this ugly old dude came along, was asking me questions that I didn't know the answer to. Like, what's up with that, Mom and Pop? I thought I was learning stuff here. I thought I was getting ready to, rule Athens, but now I'm not so sure. And so his mom and dad and, the powerful people of the time are like, look, son, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. And so again, ancient Greece, very different than 21st century United States. The way you took care of problems back then was through the judicial system, through court. Very litigious society. Very unlike... Wait a minute. No, that's just like ours. Okay, anyway. So, Socrates then is arrested and put on trial for corrupting the youth. Because from the perspective of the parents, who were giving their sons an education through these private tutors in primarily what we would call today rhetoric, right? Oratory, how to sound great and get elected. And Socrates is kind of calling that into question as to whether that's actually education or not, right? Which is part of the reason why John Dewey in the early 1900s will say anyone who wants to talk about philosophy has to talk about philosophy of education. That education is fundamentally and primarily about educating the populace. But I digress, like I always do. You've probably gotten used to that through these videos. Maybe that's why you stopped watching typically about now. Anyway, my tech team's been doing some research. Anyway, I'm going to keep talking. You can keep watching, not, whatever. So, he's put on trial for corrupting the youth. Again, from a certain perspective, it is corrupting because you're forcing them to think for themselves. Free thinking, creative thinking, critical thinking is dangerous to the status quo. Let's go back to Foucault, the powers that be. Let's make everybody normal. By normal, we mean sleepwalk through life. Just do what the powers that be tell them to do. Right? That's not what Socrates is about. Socrates is about actual education. Hey, make people think for themselves. Have them figure it out. Right? What is beauty? You use the word, maybe you should know what it means before you start talking about it. Some Heideggerian influence here as well, foreshadowing Heidegger with regards to the meaning of being, right? Existence. So Socrates put on trial for corrupting the youth. Here's his defense. You're welcome. Now, not a great defense. If you're put on trial for something, and you say, yes, I did it, but here are the reasons why, guess what? You're probably going to be found guilty. Because you're basically admitting guilt. You're saying, yes, I did the thing, but here's the reason why. It's a good, noble reason. Right? And so Socrates says, look, yes, if by corrupting the youth you mean making them think for themselves, that's exactly what I'm doing, and here's the reason why. Because if the future leaders don't think for themselves, then the great city-state of Athens, which is known for its education, which is known for its intellect, right? Sparta's the fighters, Athens is the thinkers. Athens is going to fall apart. Because we're not going to have any thinkers left. We're just going to have a bunch of great speakers. Now back then, during these times, this was sort of like court TV, and you were tried in the court of public opinion. So it wasn't a jury of your peers, of 12 folks who may or may not be your peers. That's a whole different discussion, which we talk about in ethics class. But anyway, instead it was everyone in attendance at the trial tossed in a rock. White rock, not guilty. Black rock, guilty. And the fact that it's everyone also has great influence on Plato later on. And most of this story is told in the Apology. Which is really a text where Plato is apologizing or arguing on behalf of Socrates. Sort of, though it's also probably a fairly accurate retelling, though there's some current debate about that, as to the events that actually occurred at this trial. And so, Socrates is found guilty of corrupting the youth. Unfortunately for Socrates, the penalty, the punishment for corrupting the youth, is death. It's execution. The drinking of poison, hemlock. So you can imagine this greatly impacts Plato and the other mentees of Socrates. I mean, this is a mentor-mentee relationship, especially back then, is like another father. So this is like the father figure in his life who's now going to be executed for doing the thing that he himself is trained to do. So Socrates has to drink hemlock. Now the follow-up to the Apology, Crito or Crito, C-R-I-T-O, in this dialogue takes place on, the ancient Greek equivalent of death row. And so Plato and some of the other mentees, they're fairly wealthy too, right? To receive any type of education back then, you had to be fairly wealthy, quite frankly. And so Plato and some of these other followers then go to death row, and they go to Socrates, and they're like, look, man, We know you got a bum deal. We know that what you were doing was actually good for Athens, and they just don't recognize it. That there is a distinction to be drawn between appearances and reality. There's the metaphysical claim here, that there's a difference between things that we see and things the way they actually are. What everyone saw was, one more teacher, no big deal. He's probably teaching rhetoric just like the rest of them because he's using the same words, truth, beauty, goodness, all that stuff, just like the rest of them. He's no different. So what's one less teacher of oratory or something along those lines? But in reality, he was doing something very different. In reality, he was trying to get them to think for themselves. Again, you can't force someone to think for themselves. All you can do is ask leading questions in the hopes that they begin thinking for themselves. And maybe lead to some type of enlightenment, revelation, aletheia, and we talked about that with Heidegger. So they go to Socrates and they're like, look, you got a bum deal. We know that what you were doing really was good for Athens, so here's what we're going to do. We're fairly wealthy. Let's try to get the guards to take a long lunch break, and you can just flee. Get out of here. Leave Athens. Go live out the rest of your days somewhere else, someplace maybe that would appreciate you. And Socrates, no, fellows, I appreciate it. Thank you very much, but I would rather die as a noble man than to live as an ignoble man. I would rather die as a just man than live as an unjust man. If I fled just because something didn't go my way, that would be unjust. I knew what the possible consequences were for my behavior, and I was okay with that. I implicitly agreed to the social contract of being an Athenian citizen, a citizen of Athens. If I had a problem with it, fellows, I should have left long before now. So thanks, but no thanks. Right, he becomes a martyr for philosophy, blah, 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 great. Okay. Whole lot there. Right, we've got appearance reality, we've got justice, we've got the legal system at the time, we've got a whole lot of stuff. We've got father figure dying. Stuff's going to be hugely impactful in the life of Plato. Okay? And so the excerpt that I want you guys to read, the Allegory of the Cave, comes from the Republic. And the Republic is kind of Plato's magnum opus. Okay? The overarching theme of the Republic is, what does the ideal political state look like? But in order to get there, he's also got to talk about things like ethics, economics, the role of the arts, metaphysics, so on and so forth, everything else. I could, and I'd like to try, probably teach the entirety of Intro to Philosophy using just the Republic as the text. That's how thick and rich and dense it is. And how, to quote one philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, in the early 1900s, said, all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. All of it. Plato drew the blueprint. He's the one that we have the complete works of. So everyone else is in Plato's wake. Everyone else is responding to what Plato wrote in some way or other. Either agreeing with Plato or disagreeing with Plato, or agreeing about this, disagreeing about this. He sets the scene for everything else to follow. So the Republic is from the middle period. As I said, the late period gets a little bit funky and weird. And there's even more authorial distance that Plato takes with regards to his own writing. But in the middle time period, the Republic is the centerpiece. And yeah, so I don't want to tip my hand yet. I don't want to tell you what the ideal political state is yet. I want to tell you at the end of the excerpt, even though it's not mentioned in this excerpt. So let's start, and I'll highlight a couple of things I want to point out, and then kind of let you continue reading from there. At the very bottom of the first page of the excerpt here, so this is page 69, the very last line. Oh, and by the way, this isn't dialogue form, though. You're not going to have the conventional play type notation for who's speaking. Right? So you're not going to have, Socrates says da-da-da, Glaucon says da-da-da-da-da, right? You're not going to have it set up that way. So you're just going to have to keep track of who's saying what. Okay. The important stuff, because this is a middle dialogue, the important stuff, the chunky stuff, the main paragraphs, that's going to be Socrates speaking. And again, probably Plato speaking through the character of Socrates. And the interlocutor, the other person in the dialogue, is mainly just kind of a yes man, like, huh, what? Oh, yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, wait, what about this? Okay. Just for clarification purposes. All right, so the very bottom of page 69, the very last line. The many, as we say, are seen but not known, and ideas are known but not seen. Now, this line harkens back to a discussion, debate in the truest sense of the word. Not I shout at you, you shout at me. That's not a debate. A debate, I state some points, you state some counterpoints, we discuss. Okay? This debate that's been going on long before Plato, long before Socrates, what's called pre-Socratic philosophy, between, is the world actually a stable place, or is it always changing? Is there oneness, or is there manyness? And notice here, this kind of lays the groundwork for that distinction between modernism and postmodernism. As I mentioned before, modernism, there's a grand narrative, right? Whether it be God, whether it be the universe, whether it be knowledge, reality, reason, who knows? There's some grand narrative, there's a grand story, and we're all just bit players in it. Versus the postmodern understanding, Francois Lyotard, the postmodern condition, the death of grand narratives is all just individual stories that sometimes touch one another, right? Oneness versus manyness. Stability versus flux. Being, not in the Heideggerian sense, but in the arrival, the end point sense, being. Again, stable, one, versus becoming. And the two primary philosophers which we use to articulate those points, and again, these are just fragments, so we're making presumptions, are Parmenides, oneness, stability, and Heraclitus, flux. Now, perhaps you've heard the phrase, you can't step in the same river twice. That is a quote from Heraclitus. Again, multi-layered, this phrase. It's a nice bumper sticker, but bumper stickers need explanation. You can't step in the same river twice, because the river is not the same river. The river is always changing. The banks are always changing, at least slightly, based on things like erosion, right? The water that's in, let's say, the Ohio River right now are not the same water droplets that were in the Ohio River 100 years ago, or 300 years ago, or a bajillion years ago, or any other point in time. The water droplets themselves are all different. So I wonder if it's still the Ohio River. Harkening back to the first thought experiment with the ship of Theseus. Okay. But not only is the river necessarily different and changing, so are you, so are we. Right? Heraclitus sort of laying the groundwork for postmodern, sort of laying the groundwork for Heidegger, and these guys are thousands of years apart. About 2,000 years apart. A little bit longer, 2,500 years apart. Right? But in many ways speaking the same language here. It's always becoming, always changing. Just when you think you have who you are, you're going to change. Right? That's what Heraclitus is saying. So not only can you not step in the same river twice, there's not even the same you to step in the same river twice. It's Heraclitus. Parmenides, there's one, there's stability. And so both of them agree there's a distinction between appearance and reality. Heraclitus says reality is changing. Any type of stability is mere appearance. Parmenides, no, reality is stability. Any type of flux then you see is merely appearance. Okay? So now let's harken back to this line. Let's read this line again. Because Plato is tipping his hand here. He's letting us know which side he's landing on, Parmenides or Heraclitus. The many are seen but not known. Seen. So that means it appears that way. We can access it through the world of the senses. the many, but we can't know it. Why can we not know it? Because it's not true. It's merely appearance instead of reality. Remember, knowledge is justified true belief. If it's not true, you can't know it. So if the many, change, flux, all of this stuff is mere appearance, we can see it but not know it. It's appearance, not truth, not reality. Plato is telling us, look, man, I'm on the side of Parmenides here. And he goes on then to say, ideas are known but not seen. So Plato's philosophy is going to be very abstract. It's going to be very much focused on ideas and concepts, not stuff you can see and touch and feel and all that. Touch and feel, that's the same thing. Not stuff you can access through the world of the senses. The senses are going to be limited. The senses are not going to be the be-all, end-all. Ideas are. Concepts are. The mind is where it's at. Not stuff out there. Stuff out there is always changing. The world of appearances. Things can appear differently to you than they do to me. Things can appear differently to me at various points in the day or my life or whatever. Appearance always changes. Truth does not. If truth was always changing, you could not have knowledge. Knowledge requires unchanging, capital T, truth. That's how you can know it. Otherwise, you just think you know stuff and you don't really, because it's not true, because it could change again. It could change tomorrow. It could be different yet than it was yesterday. That's not knowledge. That's guessing at that point. And if you don't have truth as an aspect, then all you have is belief that's justified. All you have is an opinion with reasons. Whoop-de-doo. That ain't knowledge. Now we'll see that relativism really is kind of an extension of that. So here again, Plato, in bringing this discussion to the forefront again, even though he's taking a side, he's also articulating the opposing position. He thinks he's going to defeat the opposing position, but the opposing position is still there and present. And this discussion, this debate, continues today. Seeing is believing? One of these things that we just throw out there, but what we're saying, if we truly believe that seeing is believing, is we're saying, no, the world of appearances is the world of reality. I can believe it once I see it. After it appears to be the case, it therefore must be the case. But if Plato's right, that's just appearance. That's not reality. The many are seen. You can see the many. You can see change. That doesn't make it true. Ideas can be true. Ideas, therefore, because they can be true, we can know them in a way that we cannot know appearances. And here I just want to point out one more extremely, extremely important passage from this excerpt. Okay? Most of the excerpt's going to focus on the divided line and the allegory of the cave. And if it seems like you're reading the same story twice, you are, and there's a specific reason why. Let's see if you can pick up on it when you do the reading. First, you got to understand it, then you got to be able to compare and contrast. Okay? And what the heck does any of it have to do with metaphysics anyway? What the heck does any of it have to do with knowledge? Right? Reality and justification and truth and belief and all that. Okay? But here's a key passage that if after you've read the excerpt, you can go back to this paragraph and really understand what it's saying, then you've probably understood Plato. This is page 71. And remember, it's going to sound very abstract. It's going to sound somewhat mystical. Okay? And I'll just read this passage. I'll point this passage out. I won't explain it because I want you to see if you can figure out what the heck it means after you've read the excerpt. And we'll come back and I'll probably start there in the next video then for Thursday. This is page 71. And there's some interesting stuff that occurs in the interim. I'm hitting the highlights, right? Remember, this is the dinner party. Okay? Hitting the highlights. One, two, the third actual paragraph. The rest of them are just kind of lines. The third paragraph here. And the soul, yeah, we're talking about souls here. The soul is like the eye. When resting upon that which truth and being shine, again, Parmenides, truth, capital T, being, right, stability. The soul is like the eye when it rests upon truth and being shine. The soul perceives and understands. Whoa. The soul perceives and understands. Not the mind, the soul. Perceives and understands and is radiant with intelligence. There's going to be a whole lot of light, dark motifs throughout. Light good, dark bad, right? Which he picks up on, right? This is imagery which appears in things like Zoroastrianism and so forth. Because what he's writing here predates Christianity and Islam, right? Contemporary of Judaism, so on and so forth, the early aspects of Judaism. Anyway, the soul perceives and understands, and it's radiant with intelligence. So the soul has intelligence. Interesting. When it rests upon truth and being and stability and oneness. But when turned toward the twilight, somewhat light, somewhat dark. When turned toward the twilight of becoming and perishing, change and flux, then she, meaning the soul, he's personifying soul here as a she has opinion only. Not knowledge, opinion. Justified belief, not truth. And justified at best, maybe it's just belief. And goes blinking about. Blinking. Like eyes. I can see something that I can't because I'm blinking. I'm exposed to the light, then I'm in the dark because I'm blinking. On and off. It's first then of one opinion, then of another, and seems then to have no intelligence. This passage, Dr. Schrappe thinks, is key to understanding the whole thing. He presents it early on before digging into the divided line, the allegory of the cave. The allegory of the cave and the divided line in many ways is just an explanation of what the heck he's talking about here. I'll read it one more time, then I'll end this video. The soul is like the eye. When resting upon that on which truth and being shine, the soul perceives and understands and is radiant with intelligence. But when turned toward the twilight of becoming and perishing, then she has opinion only and goes blinking about, first of one opinion, then of another, and seems to have no intelligence. See you next time.